So, good afternoon to everyone. We are here again for the second conference from this day, which is going to be held by Professor Jonathan Wilson. Thank you very much, Professor Wilson, and thanks to everyone here for assisting again to our second talk in this day of this third day of our international seminar from the Latin American Society of the Military Orders, for the study of the military orders and the Crusades. So Jonathan Wilson, who is going to give his talk now, is a professor from the University of Lisboa, and he got his PhD from the University of Liverpool. He's currently based in Lisbon and has taught and published extensively in the field of medieval European and Hispanic history. He's a research fellow in the project Cistercian Horizons, financed by the Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia, and he's a researcher in the Institute of Medieval Studies in the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. His latest publication in this 2021 is the book The Conquest of Santarém and Going Song of the Conquest of Alcázar do Sal, editions and translations of the Expugnatione Scalavis and Gosui de Expugnatione Salaciae Carmen, containing extended introductory and expositive chapters in the series Routledge Crusader text in translation. Now he's going to present his conference entitled Crusader Objections to Fighting in Iberia. So, as you can hear, this conference, of course, in a better go in English by Professor Wilson, is going to be now. So, Professor Wilson, thank you very much, and the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Esteban. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak, and indeed I'm very honoured. So I'm very delighted to be here with you today. Crusader Objections to Fighting in Iberia, circa 1147 to 1217. In this short contemplation of Crusader objections to fighting in Iberia, I'll be focusing mainly on the Kingdom of Portugal during the 12th and the early 13th century. Although I'll be making occasional forays into Leon, Castile and Catalonia, I'll concentrate on Portugal partly because this is the area that I know best, but more importantly because Portugal affords us a very particular and useful perspective on the Crusades, both on the movement in general, as it evolved over the long 12th century, and indeed more narrowly on what shall be our particular concern in this paper, on the question of Crusader reluctance to commit to fighting on the Andalusi frontier. For those unfamiliar with the Portuguese positioning in the period, I'd first like to set out a little background. Since at least the early 12th century, the peoples of the Western Iberian Peninsula witnessed the regular passage of ships carrying crusaders along their coasts, heading for Cape St. Vincent, the Straits of Gibraltar, and the Mediterranean beyond. For these maritime warriors coming from places including the North Rhineland, Lower Saxony, Denmark, Frisia, Flanders, and the British Isles, it was Portugal, located along the peninsular Atlantic coast, that until the 1230s offered the very last ports in Christian hands before the Mediterranean. Importantly, these contingents could sometimes be persuaded, usually in exchange for plunder, to participate in Portuguese royal campaigns against the Muslims of Al-Andalus. Regarding sources, we are relatively fortunate in that we have three more or less well-documented principal instances of this phenomenon, spanning the periods of the Second, Third, and Fifth Crusades, so roughly a 70-year period. These concern the three major Christian victories of the Iberian Far West during this time: the conquests of the Islamic naval strongholds of Lisbon in 1147, Sils in 1189, and Alcázar do Sal in 1217. And indeed, we have lengthy eyewitness testimonies for each, which are there shown in the slide. Now, the reason for the peculiar geography of these conquests, given the chronology, is the massive Almohad counterattack that followed the conquest of Sils, and which in 1191 not only reconquered that city, but also drove the Portuguese frontier right back to the Lisbon side of the River Tagus. Although northern fleets sailing south were almost always forced to stop in Portugal to take on supplies before embarking upon the long passage through the Muslim-controlled Gulf of Cadiz and Strait of Gibraltar, it was by no means a foregone conclusion that their personnel could be convinced to stay and fight. Many of these warriors were intent upon reaching the Holy Land, and in so doing, fulfilling their crusading vows in response to various papal exhortations. And frequently, they were very reluctant to countenance any deviation or delay in reaching their principal destination. Of course, these concerns were not applicable to the foreign contingents that came specifically with the intent of aiding Christian princes in Iberia, notably forces from France and from Genoa and Pisa, including, for example, the French expedition led by Duke Eudes I Borel of Burgundy, that came to the aid of Alfonso VI of Leon Castile following his defeat by the Almoravids at Zalaca in 1086. Or the Catalan campaign to take Tarragona from the early 1090s. Or the so-called Balearics campaign of 1113 to 1115, undertaken by a combined force of Catalan, Pisan and French forces under Ramon Berenguer II. And of course the various campaigns of Alfonso I, the Battler of Aragon. However, it's reasonably clear that, save for Burgundian involvement in principally defensive campaigns in Galicia and in the county of Portucale in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and especially following the establishment of the Franks in the Holy Land in 1099, Portuguese experience of foreign aid on the far western Iberian frontier principally involved contingents of seaborne crusaders who were very definitely intent on reaching the Holy War in Palestine. As is well rehearsed in the historiography, popular fixation on the geographical city of Jerusalem, which was almost certainly only a secondary part of Urban II's vision, had been stimulated by a number of overlapping factors, including the unrivaled sanctity of Jerusalem in the Christian cosmology, place of Christ's passion and resurrection, the preaching of the First Crusade by clerics across the Latin West following Urban II's 1095 appeal at Clermont, the reporting in the West both by chroniclers and by returning crusaders of the great victory of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, the increase in Christo-mimetic devotion enhanced during the 11th century by the increase in popularity of the Jerusalem pilgrimage, and of course bringing with it the notion of taking up the cross of Christ in the place where his feet have stood. And importantly, a series of papal exhortations to go to the east to preserve and defend the Frankish presence there. No doubt we can think of more reasons. Looking at the scenario from a Portuguese point of view, in that far-flung and more or less isolated far western zone of the peninsula, passing Crusader fleets presented a most precious and potentially decisive resource. Importantly, from about the late 1130s and perhaps earlier, Portuguese ambitions had become increasingly fixated upon achieving and maintaining independence from the king emperors of Leon Castile. Alfonso Henriques, who would soon become Portugal's first king, had initially directed his ambitions towards Galicia. However, a succession of manoeuvres with a triangular power play between Alfonso Henriques, his cousin and rival King Emperor Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, and the Pope urged Alfonso Henriques that his best prospects for establishing autonomy was through his conquest of the Muslim south. Further, this course of action was now specially urged upon him because in 1144, Alfonso Henriques had opted to operate a ruse to preserve the territorial integrity of his policy as against Alfonso VII by becoming a vassal of the Holy See. Now, as a miles sancti petri, he could extend his lands while pursuing an ostensible mission of liberating the Church of the Iberian West, through which he hoped to obtain from a grateful Pope the recognition of the Holy See for his rightful kingship, and thereby achieve unquestioned independence from Leon Castile. Given his drive for autonomy, it can readily be appreciated that Alfonso Henriques would not accept aid from other Iberian Christian princes, and most certainly not from Leon Castile. Indeed, the discourse in the sources is quite unequivocal that he had no intention of sharing with anyone his conquest of the Iberian South. Coalitions tending, of course, to lead to squabbles over ownership of newly acquired territories. This would be demonstrated only too clearly in the next century in the disputes between Portugal and Castile over the rights to newly conquered Algarve. So for Alfonso Henriques, seeking aid from his Christian neighbours was simply not an option. Yet Portugal suffered the same shortage of manpower that was endemic in the period among the Iberian Christian polities, and Alfonso Henriques badly needed reinforcements if his plans for conquest were to be achieved. In this light, fleets of well-armed Christian holy warriors passing his coasts must have seemed to Alfonso Henriques truly heaven-sent, for they provided the only practical and, importantly, the only acceptable aid available to him. Now, as I mentioned, the Crusaders themselves were often not too keen to join the Portuguese kings in their programs of conquest. Here, Crusader objections appear to fall into two different camps, with an overlap here and there. And these are the temporal or practical objections and the spiritual objections. So let's deal first with the temporal objections. Firstly, we can note that the three principal events in this scheme revolved around coastal cities: Lisbon, Alcácer, and Silves. Certainly, these were important strategic targets, crucial naval and economic centres that the Christians needed first to neutralise and then control. However, it's likely there was another far more humdrum reason for choosing these coastal locations. Although there's little in the sources that it is explicit, it's more than likely that Crusaders on their way by sea to the east simply could not be persuaded in sufficient numbers to undertake a penetration of the Andalusi interior for fear of becoming embroiled in complex and dangerous campaigns of uncertain duration and outcome in unknown terrain. In support of this argument, King Sancho I's 1189 Silves campaign is highly instructive. On the 29th of October 1187, in the wake of the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, Pope Gregory VIII promulgated his bull Audita Tremendi, summoning the Third Crusade. In an instant, King Sancho of Portugal confronted the prospect of an imminent fresh flow of fleets packed with keen, well-armed warriors calling into his ports, potential reinforcements whose aid, if it could be secured, offered him a splendid opportunity for undertaking the urgent work of further strengthening his frontier and striking a powerful anticipatory blow in the face of the Almohad offensive that he knew was imminent within the next year or two. Rather than concentrating his efforts closer to home to consolidate his vulnerable eastern frontier, Sancho chose the more difficult and dangerous option of campaigning in the far south of the peninsula because he had little alternative if he were to employ passing crusaders. Before the Silves campaign, his established southern borderlands extended from Alcácer in the west to Évora in the east, at which point the frontier turned northward towards Estremoz. Following a series of powerful Almohad incursions beginning in 1179 and culminating in the campaign of 1184, the town of Évora had become an isolated Christian outpost, far from the banks of the Tagus, which, for practical purposes of effective defence, were, as Alexander Herculano said, the true permanent limits of southern Portugal at the time. In those 5 years, the Portuguese had lost Beja, Murtala and Serpa, and now the areas to the south, east and north of Évora were either deserted or under Muslim control. In the light of this situation, in order to strengthen the position of Évora, Sancho's preferred target in 1189 would likely have been Juramenia, about 50 kilometres to the northeast of Évora, in an effort to push the Portuguese eastern frontier up to the natural barrier of the River Guadiana. Indeed, in a charter dated 1187, Sancho I gave to the master of the Order of Évora, Gonzalo Viegas, and his brethren, the castle of Juramenia, if God grants it to me. However, if Sancho were to reap any advantage at all from the military possibilities now ranged before him, occasioned by the impending passage of Crusader fleets along his coasts, he would have to change his plans. For the reasons I've already suggested, it was most unlikely the Crusaders could be persuaded to undertake a penetration of the Andalusi interior to attack an obscure town like Juramenia, which might easily turn into a lengthy and precarious enterprise. For Sancho, the choice was stark. Either he could look on passively as the Crusader vessels flowed through his ports, reprovisioning their stores before pressing on eastward, allowing thereby so much precious military potential to slip through his fingers. Or he could change his plans to fit a theatre of war that would work for Crusaders in transit. He set his sights on the rich and populous Almohad province of Alfagar, and in particular its famously opulent capital, Silves. Here, not only was there the promise of plentiful and splendid plunder, attractive to crusading forces, not least for financing their trip to Palestine, but the capture of Silves would neutralise a dangerous Almohad naval stronghold from which were launched so many seaborne raids ravaging Lisbon and Alcázar. In the event, Sancho and the Crusaders did succeed in capturing Silves in September of 1189. But significantly, the plan was premature. It had been forced by opportunism rather than good sense. Sancho still did not have sufficient control of the area of the extreme southwestern peninsula. And the Almohads, mustering a characteristically massive army, mounted a terrific counterattack in Al-Andalus from 1190 and retook Silves with relative ease in 1191. Further practical considerations militating against Crusader involvement in extraneous campaigns was the wear and tear and inevitable consumption of Crusader equipment and materials. Sieges involve the application of a substantial amount of material resources, including rope, wood, iron, and hides for the building of siege engines, tools for the cutting of shot for the catapults, arrows for the bowmen, and victuals for the feeding of the army. Since it was the practice, as had happened at Silves and at Alcázar, for the defenders in anticipation of the impending siege to take care to strip the surrounding countryside of as much usable resources as possible, including poisoning the wells, denuding the land of trees for timber, and removing or destroying all foodstuffs, including cattle. The pressures on any incoming attacking force from the first moments of its arrival in the vicinity can readily be appreciated. The case of the siege of Alcázar de Sal in 1217 provides a good example of this. In order for the combined Christian forces to bring the siege to a successful conclusion, two immense wooden towers, taller than the walls of the fortress, were constructed, such that they could rain down arrows into the midst of the castle compound. However, because of the scorched earth policy in the region operated by the Almohads, the wood for these towers could only be obtained by cannibalizing some 8 of the Crusaders' ships. Apparently, these ships could not be replaced, and their crews were later absolved by Pope Honorius III of their vows to continue their journey to the east, because their ships were now destroyed. So it was probably well understood then that an extraneous campaign in Iberia could certainly and very abruptly put an end to Crusaders' dreams of reaching Jerusalem. Nevertheless, it's reasonably clear that in all three of the principal actions here highlighted, Lisbon, Sils and Alcácer, that some elements in the Crusader fleets had indeed arrived to Portuguese shores already prepared to participate in some limited actions on the Portuguese Andalusi frontier. And the key word here is limited. At Sils, as we see here in this line, the view of the formidable North Wall, at Sils, certainly the maritime crusaders that besieged the city had been contracted by Sancho I to do the job. This agreement probably already being in place before the fleet had departed its German homelands in Lower Saxony. Yet, once the siege had begun to drag on longer than apparently the Crusaders had anticipated, discontent began to grow in the camp, as is reported in the Dea Tanara Navali, the eyewitness account of the siege penned by an anonymous German crusader. In order to appease the Crusaders and apparently to compensate them for the delay as the siege dragged on, King Sancho promised the Crusaders that besides granting them the plunder in the city, he would donate 1/10 of all royal profits from the enterprise to the Holy Sepulchre. And then in a further development, Sancho, concerned to preserve the captured city as far as possible undamaged and to preserve the defeated population, in fact a key Portuguese economic preoccupation, Sancho attempted to persuade the Crusaders to forgo their sack of the city in return for a payment in money. First, an offer of 10,000 maravedì, 10,000 gold coins, minted for the first time by Sancho himself, and based on the Almoravid gold dinar. It was a generous offer. And then Sancho even raised that by 100% to 20,000 maravedì. However, even this extraordinarily generous offer, the Crusaders refused, precisely because they were concerned over the delay there would be in Sancho having the money brought from his northern territories. In the end, there appears to have been some kind of armed standoff between the Portuguese and the Crusaders, as Sancho intervened to protect the population and the infrastructure of Sils from the violence of the Crusaders, which led to the Crusaders refusing to have anything more to do with the Portuguese campaigns, and indeed they there and then refused to participate in the postulated Portuguese attack on eastern Algarve and the port town of Faro. Thus the Crusaders returned to their ships and quit the port of Sils with a good deal of rancour against the Portuguese king, and they continued their eastward voyage. It's worth noting here the dissonance between the brutal attitudes of the Northerners and the more restrained approach of the Hispanic Christians to the Muslims. The Northern Europeans, it seems, frequently fail to understand the economic desirability of preserving defeated populations as valuable resources and as a means of maintaining infrastructure, agriculture and trade, and providing an important source of taxation for their new Christian overlords. Something that became manifest also in the Holy Land, when the Frankish settlers were faced with the realities of settlement and the need to work with the Muslims, subjugated or otherwise. We see further elements of this lack of interface between Northern European and Iberian Christian attitudes during the Las Navas campaign in 1212, where, in the initial stages of the operation, the northern newcomers, the ultramontanos, demonstrated their characteristic xenophobia when a French contingent, arriving early to Toledo in February, had massacred a number of Jews in the city and had to be restrained by the Toledan militia. Such brutality would again be in evidence just 4 days out of Toledo, when on the 24th of June, an advance party of French crusaders, apparently under the command of Archbishop Arnaud Armory, the legendary bête noire of the Béziers massacre during the Albigensian crusade, arrived to the town of Malagon and, as it's described. In a moment, as if in the wink of an eye, they ripped it from the hands of the Moors and cut to pieces as many people as they found there. So says the Latin Chronicle of the Kings of Castile. In his letter of the 11th of August, addressed to the Cistercian General Chapter, reporting the events of the great success of the Spanish Crusade, Arnaud Armaury recounted the incident at Malagon with characteristic coolness. In his version of events, the garrison at Malagon had offered to surrender, agreeing to be enslaved, but such was not pleasing to the Crusaders, the castle being subsequently surrendered by the castellan in return for the lives of himself and his two sons, the remainder of the garrison being left to the mercy of the pilgrims. Therefore, all but a very few of those who were found there were slain, as Armory puts it. It appears possible, even likely, that some of the Crusaders involved in the Malagon slaughter were the very same as who had perpetrated similar acts in the Languedoc. A little later on, when the army arrived to Calatrava-la-Vieja, the former headquarters of the Order of Calatrava, Armory is careful to explain that it had been pleasing to the leaders of the expedition, in order to avoid Christian casualties, to allow the Muslims to depart with their lives. One's left with the suspicion Armory himself would have preferred a more permanent solution. Nevertheless, it's of note that, according to Alfonso VIII's version of the events contained in his letters to Innocent III, terms were agreed at the urging of the brothers of Calatrava, who saw that the fortress could not be taken without undermining and thereby destroying the fortifications, which would have made the position difficult to defend thereafter. Certainly it was at this point that the vast majority of the Ultramontanos became exasperated and famously abandoned the crusade, returning to their northern homelands. Arnaud Armaury glossed over the incident in his letters, but the Muslim chronicler Abd al-Wahid al-Marrakushi commented, "A large number of Christians withdrew from Alfonso, may God curse him, when he prevented them from killing the Muslims who were in the castle. They said, 'You've only brought us along with you to help you conquer the country and forbid us to plunder and kill the Muslims. We don't have any need for your company if you're going to act in this way.'" Aside from northern suspicion over Hispanic Christian attitudes to the Muslims, there's evidence in the sources of a more general northern Crusader mistrust of things Iberian. One example of this, and here quite a specific one, emerges from a passage of the De Explanatione Lisbonense, the ostensibly eyewitness Anglo-Norman account of the 1147 conquest of Lisbon, where we learn that certain Crusaders among the Anglo-Norman force complained that they'd once before, 5 years earlier in 1142, joined a Portuguese royal attempt to capture Lisbon, but that King Alfonso Henriques had suddenly abandoned the campaign, leading to the ultimate collapse of the enterprise. The complaint is, in essence, that the Portuguese king is not worthy of trust. Now, what in fact happened in 1142, we don't know. The events are obscure, and we only possess a very brief account in the Annals Domini Alfonsi, which were produced in Portugal in about 1185. Whether the Portuguese ruler had been forced abruptly to quit the walls of Lisbon in order to redeploy his troops in the rear to fight off an attack by an enemy force sent southward from the powerful Muslim fortress of Santarém, some 85 kilometres to the northeast, is unknown, but not unlikely. In any event, before 1147, before the 1147 Lisbon operation began, Alfonso Henriques had, in a daredevil nocturnal attack, relying purely on stealth, surprise, and a good dose of big brass cojones, managed to take Santarém in March of that year in order to ensure that the failure of 1142 would not be repeated. Again, a Crusader mistrust of Portuguese forces is notable at Silves in 1189. In addition to the German Crusaders' complaints that Sancho I had reneged on the bargain initially struck with the Crusaders, including the author alleges King Sancho's failure to give the promised 1/10 of the proceeds of the conquest to the Holy Sepulchre. The author also reports on the laziness of the Portuguese warriors, who he reports wouldn't work in the siege, but merely stood by mocking the Crusaders for being foolish enough to exert themselves in trying to capture a fortress which they repeatedly claimed was obviously impregnable. Although the German Crusaders' account, while superbly detailed, is inconsistent in various respects. What does emerge very clearly from this source is that there were multiple disputes between bands of Crusaders and bands of Portuguese warriors, and also ultimately between the Crusaders and King Sancho. And this was, it appears, largely on account of the different agendas being pursued by the different parties. The Crusaders were concerned to reach the Holy Land as expeditiously as possible. King Sancho, on the other hand, was preoccupied more with long-term strategic and economic considerations than holy war per se, i.e. the liberation of the Hispanic Church. Further misunderstandings were to break out in the next year at Lisbon in the summer of 1190. In about early July of that year, a flotilla of 63 Anglo-Norman ships, part of Richard's fleet, arrived at Lisbon to take on supplies. While 500 good men went to help Sancho defend Santarem against the Almohads, many more of their shipmates went on the rampage in Lisbon, ill-treating and despoiling local Jewish and Muslim residents who'd been granted special rights and privileges by Alfonso Henriques after the conquest in 1147. The ensuing riots only ended when Sancho's police arrested some 700 of the mariners, forced them to make reparations, and extracted undertakings from their leaders that discipline henceforth would be maintained, punishments enforced, and that rights and property would be respected whilst they were in the Portuguese kingdom, following which the fleet departed. Let's now turn briefly to consider some spiritual objections. That there was an element of general mistrust between peoples of very different regions, cultures and backgrounds is probably to be expected. Yet the trouble in Lisbon in 1190 seems to have been at least partly due to the foreigners' misunderstanding and mistrust of the comparative state of convivencia between the three principal religions subsisting in Lisbon at that time. This probably fed into a more general northern suspicion concerning the Iberian Christian kingdoms, and especially their orthodoxy, possibly on account of their large minorities of Jews and Muslims. An indication in this direction comes from a 13th century source, which is William the Breton's Deeds of King Philip Augustus of France. In his account of the battle of Bouvines of 1214, William includes a vignette concerning the old Countess of Flanders, Countess Teresa, or Matilda of Portugal, daughter of Alfonso Henriques, widow of the Count of Flanders Philip of Alsace, who died of disease at Acre in 1191. William writes, "It has become common knowledge that the old Countess Teresa of Flanders, aunt of the current Count of Flanders Fernando, had wished to know the outcome of the Battle of Bouvines. She cast her fortune according to the custom of the Spaniards, who readily use this art, and received truthful answers, but with a double meaning, in accordance with the devil's habit of always deceiving in the end those that serve him." Further, on top of whatever general suspicions there may have been in the north over Hispanic Christian practices, there was the simple fact that obviously Iberia was not the Holy Land, nor could it hope to compete with it in sanctity, despite the impressive attempts of Archbishop Diego Galmires of Santiago de Compostela. Certainly in Portugal, the king and his circle of advisors were acutely aware of this problem. Faced with powerful Crusader partiality for campaigning in the Holy Land, stratagems appear to have been adopted to infuse the Portuguese kingdom, and in particular Lisbon, with extra sanctity as a crucial device in convincing doubters of the divine value of the war on Islam in the Iberian West. Especially following the Conference of Lisbon in 1147, there is evidence that individuals and parties, not always readily identifiable, but certainly more or less connected to the Portuguese royal court, operated a deliberate and identifiable policy in order to attract more passing Jerusalem-bound Crusaders to the fight on their frontier with Islam. These tactics of attraction, as we might call them, were put into practice in large part through the promulgation of relevant saintly cults, not only those with traditions already established in the region, such as Saints Maxima, Verissimus and Julia, but also through the promotion of new or newly imported saints. Of the latter variety, the 4th century Christian martyr St. Vincent of Zaragoza was the prime example, being installed as patron saint of Lisbon following the translation of his remains to the city in 1173 from the cave that bears his name in Iberia's extreme southwestern corner. Meanwhile, new saints were presented and promoted in order to appeal to specific audiences in the parts of Europe renowned as areas prodigious in the production of previous Crusader help on the Portuguese frontier. Most famously, one Henry of Bonn, a Rhinelander, was proclaimed a great hero and martyr of the 1147 conquest of Lisbon in the anonymous Indiculum Fundationis Monasterii Beati Vincentii, a text produced in Portugal in 1188 amid the furore of the Third Crusade. In particular, his cult was associated with a miraculous Jerusalem palm tree that sprouted from his tomb in Lisbon, the leaves of which had the power to heal the sick. The palm tree image is notably connected with the notion of the Jerusalem pilgrimage and the Iter Earosolimitana, or the journey to Jerusalem. Importantly, Archbishop Diego de Almeida of Compostela and others, including apparently in Portugal, had promoted the notion of the Iter per Hispaniam, or the journey to Jerusalem through Spain, in order to bring Iberia firmly within the scope of the campaigns in the East, and importantly, within any perceived pilgrimage element in the Eastern crusading phenomenon. It's certainly interesting that in all of the 3 eyewitness accounts here considered, the authors describe their fellow crusaders explicitly as pilgrims. However, by far the most effective mechanism for dispelling crusader qualms, even if not entirely successful, was the crusade indulgence, as specifically applied to Iberia. Indeed, for Hans Eberhard Meyer, the inducement of the indulgence, quote, put all other inducements in the shade. And indeed, this appears to be a fair summary of the situation. I want here then to conclude with a brief consideration of the possible existence of a now lost specific papal bull of indulgence for Alfonso Henrique's 1147 Lisbon campaign. In this respect, we shall refer once again to the Anglo-Norman eyewitness account of the De Explanatio Lisbonense. In an early section, well before the fleet arrives to Portugal, the author recounts the events of the Anglo-Norman squadron in crossing the notorious Bay of Biscay during characteristically terrifyingly stormy conditions. I quote, "As night came on, a tempest arose and we were scattered in every direction. Indeed, the excessive darkness of the night and the unaccustomed tossing of the waves compelled even the bravest of our seamen to despair. At intervals the sirens were heard, a horrible sound, first of wailing and then of laughter and jeering, like the clamour of insolent men in a camp. How many there were who, becoming penitent and confessing their sins and shortcomings, with sorrow and groaning and atoning with a flood of tears for the perversion of their pilgrimage, however it had begun, offered sacrifices to God upon the altar of a contrite heart." The passage is significant since it indicates at least some members of the fleet were anticipating an action in Portugal, and moreover that a proportion of them considered it an illegitimate deviation from their holy purpose. Their mission being to rescue and defend the churches of the East, notably Edessa, and the holy places in Palestine. Bearing that in mind, let's look very briefly at a short letter, only a few lines long, the so-called letter 308, following the Mabillon Mine, the clerk numbering of Bernard's letters, St. Bernard of Clairvault's letters. It's of disputed authenticity, and it purports to be a letter from Bernard of Clairvaux addressing Alfonso Henriques, in which Bernard replies favourably to an appeal made by the Portuguese monarch for unspecified aid, but which has been argued in recent scholarship to refer to King Alfonso, requesting that St. Bernard, during his preaching of the Second Crusade in northern France, Flanders and Germany, recruit crusaders en route by sea to the Holy Land to go to the aid of Alfonso Henriques in his projected campaign to capture Lisbon in 1147. Importantly, we're also informed in letter 308 that a certain Roland, apparently a monk from Bernard's own Abbey of Clairvaux, is hastening to the King of Portugal, bringing with him Apostolae Largitatis Literis, which can be translated as letters conveying the papal concessions, which, under the circumstances, is taken to mean some form of papal warrant for Alfonso Henrique's planned campaign against the Andalusian Muslims. Very intriguingly, it's notable that St Bernard never crossed the English Channel to preach in England, and thus it may be imagined that the Anglo-Norman elements in the fleet of northern European folk, which eventually helped in the attack on Lisbon, were somewhat less sanguine about the Portuguese venture than their Flemish or Rhinelander counterparts. Thus, the issue of a specific indulgence for the conquest of Lisbon, explicitly setting out the spiritual rewards on offer to foreign holy warriors, would have been a crucial, if not an indispensable, component of Alfonso Henrique's enterprise. No bull detailing the Lisbon indulgence has yet been identified, but echoes of its likely existence are detectable in the sources. And it's here we must keep in mind the mysterious letters conveying the papal concession carried to Portugal by Bernard's envoy, the monk Roland, of letter 38. Turning again to the De Expeditione Lisbonense, we have no reason to doubt the author's account of the welcoming of the Anglo-Norman part of the Crusader fleet, which, having suffered the previously mentioned stormy crossing of the Bay of Biscay, arrived to the port of Porto a few days or so ahead of the Flemish and Rhinelander squadrons. Having entered the harbour, the Anglo-Normans were greeted by Bishop Pedro Pitois of Porto. Importantly, the De Expeditione Lisbonense tells us that, presumably at the behest of the bishop, all the members of the fleet, early on the morning following their arrival, gathered at the top of the hill in the cathedral churchyard. As the author explains, for our numbers were so great that the church would not hold us, in order to receive absolution of sins and a benediction from the bishop. As highlighted almost a century ago by Luis Gonzaga de Azevedo, this can have been no ordinary confession and absolution, a sacrament that the Crusaders received every week and for which they had brought their own priests, one assigned to each ship. Rather, this would have been a very special absolution, which, in the circumstances, is likely to have been the plenary indulgence of crusade, administered to the personnel of the fleet by the Bishop of Porto on the specific authority of Eugenius III. And here it's instructive to call to mind Alexander II's grant of indulgence to those warriors headed to Islamic Spain in 1064, and which almost certainly relates to the campaign which had involved a force of Aquitanians, Burgundians, Normans and other French forces, lending aid to a Catalan force and perhaps also an Aragonese force to capture Islamic Barbastro in the northern Ebro Valley. Importantly, it's highly likely that this is one of the most specific crusade indulgences we possess, insofar as it sets out the four-stage process of the indulgence rite. The letter is as follows. With fatherly love, we exhort those who are intending to journey to Spain that they take the greatest care to achieve those aims, which with divine admonishment they have decided to accomplish. May each of them confess, according to the quality of his sins, to his bishop or spiritual father, unless the devil be able to accuse him of impenitence, may a measure of penitence be enjoined upon them. We, however, by the authority of the holy apostles Peter and Paul, lift the penance from them and grant a remission of sins. Our prayers go with. So the elements are auricular confession, the imposition of penance, and then the remission of penance, and then the remission of sins. The Crusaders are exhorted to receive the sacrament of penance by confession of their sins to their confessor. In this case, the Anglo-Normans confess to the pastor assigned to their relevant ship. The confessor is then instructed to impose a suitable penance on the penitent. Now that this initial two-stage requirement of sacramental confession is fulfilled, the Pope, by the authority of the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, in this case through the mouthpiece of the Bishop of Porto, grants a plenary indulgence to all those who perform the prescribed work for gaining the indulgence. Of course, As we know, popes relied upon bishops and clergy not only to support and propagate their expeditions, but also to recruit knights and soldiers. We see this with Alexander II and with Gregory VII. Innocent III, for the Las Navas campaign, called upon the prelates of France and Provence, ordering them to pronounce the indulgence of absolution from sins for all who participated in the crusade or supported it financially. Are we then justified in suspecting a lost bull of indulgence for the conquest of Lisbon? Certainly the complaints raised by Alfonso Henrique's rival, Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, with Pope Eugenius III, following the Portuguese victory, leaves a distinct impression that the Pope had indeed granted such a concession. Eugenius' discourse being along the lines of, just as he had granted Alfonso VII an indulgence for the conquest of Almeria, so he also granted one to Alfonso Henrique for the conquest of Lisbon. Certainly this is a very reasonable and indeed conservative reading of the correspondence. This interpretation is reinforced by Rodrigo de Jimenez de Rada, his observation in the De Rebus Hispaniae that this Alfonso Henriques from Pope Eugenius III had obtained many privileges and indulgences. Finally, the question of papal authority and the presence or not of an indulgence rise to the fore in the case of the campaign to Alcácer de Sal in 1217. Innocent III, at the Fourth Lateran Council, had specifically refused a request of the Bishop of Lisbon for northern crusaders on their way to the Fifth Crusade in the east to be granted permission to stop in Portugal for action on the Andalusi frontier. This detail is reported uniquely in a Frisian source, and indeed the Frisian contingent of the combined northern fleet, no doubt mindful of the Pope's disapproval, refused to take part in the operation at Alcácer, and having resupplied their ship stores in Lisbon, continued their voyage to the east. It's also significant that the Pope had temporarily withdrawn the indulgence for foreign fighters in Iberia in his Fifth Crusade bull, Quia Maior. No doubt, Innocent III, mindful of the success of Las Navas in 1212, and therefore content with progress in Hispania, and at the same time still painfully aware of the debacle of the diversion of the Fourth Crusade to Byzantium, was hoping this time to make sure all attention was focused on the Holy Land. Thank you. Hello?
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Wilson. It was indeed a really nice exposition and a very novel one. I think I am more tempted to read the books that you just recently published and learn more about these sources which are new now for us. So, well, I have a lot of questions, but there are a few of the assistants. So I will start first with them, and then if we have time, we could make another from myself or any other. So please be free to write it in English or in Spanish or Portuguese if you want. So, well, here is the first one. Among the spiritual objections, did you find any doctrinal justification in the authors you study? If that was the case, which were the main sources? Fathers of the Church, Gospels, the main sources quoted.
Did you find any doctrinal justification in the authors? If that was the case, with my son. The only reference I think that I came across to the Fathers is a reference to St. Jerome, which is in the mentioned in the De Explanatione Lisbonense, and this reference is included in the sermon that's delivered to the Anglo-Norman Crusaders by Pedro Quitois. And he says, he quotes St. Jerome, and if I remember rightly, the quotation is something like this. It is not the arrival to Jerusalem that's important. It's the way in which you arrive there. In other words, it's important to lead a good life along the way. So he's emphasizing that particular patristic authority to emphasize for the Crusaders that they must do good. It's not enough just to go to Jerusalem, they must do their Christian duty along the way. And it's a way of getting them to two things. Well, one thing really. It's another way of bringing the iter per eros limitana within the ambit of the iter per Hispaniam. In other words, making that sojourn in Iberia a fundamental part of the Jerusalem journey, of the Jerusalem pilgrimage, if you like. Now, throughout all of this, there lurks in the background, really, Pope Urban II's formulation, which was really, I think it's clear from his correspondence, a counterattack against the Muslim expansion that had begun in 632, the explosion out of the Arabian Peninsula, overtaking the Christian world. And Urban II is clear that he perceives the war on three fronts. Firstly, Sicily, the northern conquest of Sicily, then extended to Hispania, Barbastro, really. And that's why I think Alexander II's formulation of the indulgence is so important. And thirdly, the extension, which is perfectly natural from Pope Urban's point of view, to the Holy Land. So it's not correct, I think, and I think it's clear from a reading of the direct evidence. It's not correct to consider the First Crusade. The First Crusade, in fact, probably the First Crusade begins at the Council of Melfi in 1059. Now, whether that is underpinned by various patristic justifications, but specifically in terms of the Crusader objections that I'm talking about, I have to say I haven't really so far found specific patristic authority. No.
Well, thank you very much. And now another one. So, do you know if this kind of objections took place in another Crusader scenarios like the Baltic Crusades?
I don't know. I haven't looked at that yet, and thank you. I will be looking at that in the future. But I'm going to say I suspect not, because those Crusaders already know that they're going to campaign in a specific geographical area. So the Baltic Crusaders know they're going to crusade in the Baltic. They're not on their way to Jerusalem, and that's why Portugal is such an interesting window, because almost exclusively passing through Portugal are Crusaders on their way somewhere else. And although Urban II's formulation is the liberation of the church wherever it's oppressed, whether it's in Spain, Sicily, the Middle East, or wherever, that's his mission. That's his mission. He sees this as a fulfillment of a prophecy of Deuteronomy, that God changes the seasons. He sets up kings and he destroys kings. And that's what he sees happening before his very eyes. And he thinks that that's his duty. God's made him Pope at that time to push forward that program. But that doesn't really translate to the ordinary Crusaders, because as I hopefully set out in the talk, the fixation was inevitably on Jerusalem, because it's the most sacred place in the Christian universe. Nothing can compete with that, you know. And although it's only secondary to Urban II's formulation, certainly for the common Crusader, I mean, as I mentioned, all of those Crusaders and those eyewitness accounts described themselves as pilgrims. Well, pilgrimage really wasn't part of Urban II's formulation. First time pilgrimage is mentioned by a pope is by Paschal II on the 28th of April, 1100.
Okay.
1100. Yeah.
Well, neither do I. So, well, there is another question from Professor Dirceu Marchini Neto, which is, can we consider the following statement correct? So I'm going to show now the following statement. Until the 12th century, Christians continually fought against Muslims and constantly against other Christians, and developing a secular culture of war, which only became related to the sense of the Crusader after the preaching of the First Crusade. So I can read the part before if you want.
Yes, can we have that? Can we have that?
Okay, and then you can read the continuation there. Until the 12th century, Christians continually fought against Muslims and constantly against other Christians, developing a secular culture of war, which only became related to the sense of the Crusade after the preaching of the First Crusade. So, is this a correct statement?
I think you can certainly read things that way. Certainly in Hispania, because the Hispanic princes, the Hispanic Christian princes, were notorious for allying with the Almohads. Alfonso IX allies with the Almohads, and then Sancho I inaugurates, well, almost the first Portuguese crusade by asking the Pope for a crusading indulgence against Alfonso IX in whatever it is, 1190. So he asked for a crusade against a fellow Christian, who happened to be in alliance with the Almohads. And one of the I can't remember. One of the leaders, I can't remember who it is now. The King of Navarre, Sancho of Navarre. One of the leaders, along with Alfonso VIII of the Las Navas crusade, he's also in alliance with the Almohads. And I think Arnaud Armory pays him a visit on the way down, persuades him out of it. But yes, the sanctification of war, it's entirely possible. I can't think of any more examples of it at the moment. I'm sorry, I can't really talk about that. I haven't got any more to say about that. I'd have to look at it more, I think.
So, well, thank you very much. And well, if there is any other question, I would like to do just one by myself regarding your last book and the archives that you work with or within. So if you could tell us something about the sources, where did you find? Because it seems like Portugal to be a good place for.
Well, the book, The Conquest of Santarém and Goswin's Song of the Conquest of Alcacer-del-Sal, the reason why those two texts are together in one book are that those two texts are together. They're found together in their unique copies in a codex of the Cistercian monastery, the great Cistercian house of Alcobaça in Portugal, Santa Maria de Alcobaça, and it's in it is. Found that these two texts directly follow one on the other on the final quire of the codex, which has literally been sewn on as an afterthought. The rest of the book contains a full copy of Orosius' 7 histories against the pagans, 7 books of history against the pagans, and a selection of letters by Fulgentius of Rust. Now, when that's finished, we have the colophon of the scribe, and then we have this extraneous quire just sewn on. This is from about the mid-13th century. So those are the two texts, and so they fitted together. One deals with the conquest of Santarém in 1147. One deals with the conquest of Alcacer-del-Sal in 1217. They're both relatively short texts. They're very rich texts, however, and there's an awful lot to say about them. So, as you would see from the book, it seemed to me, as I went about unpacking the text and the circumstances of the production, that there was a very strong link with the monastery of Villers in Brabant, in particular, I identify the author as one Goswin of Beausoot, who was the cantor of the monastery of Villers in Brabant. Now, Villers and Alcobaça were both founded at around the same time by St Bernard, both from Clairvaux. Of course, Villers was founded in 1147 during Bernard's preaching tour of Belgium and the Rhineland and that area. And Alcobaça is founded in 1153, really on the back of the conquest of Lisbon. In fact, the point of putting Alcobaça where it is, which is north of Lisbon, is to actually use the famous Cistercian ability to colonize and tame land and put in infrastructure. Because, of course, the fundamental economic concern of the Portuguese is not only they don't want to just take the land, they've got to settle it. They've got to settle it, because if it's not settled, then the Muslims will just come back and overtake it. But you can't get settlers in there unless you've got infrastructure. So you put in the Cistercians, they put in infrastructure, then you can attract settlers. The settlers start farming, then they've got a stake, and they'll defend that against anybody who tries to take it from them. So that's what so there are all sorts of things, interesting things to say about that, and particularly as I was talking about the Urban II's vision of the Crusade as being a very broad one, and seeing it on those three fronts. And if you look at it on those three fronts, starting in Sicily, and the crucial thing about what makes it different, what makes a crusade different, is with the Normans in Italy, from the Council of Melfi, then the invasion, the conquest of Sicily starts in 1060, so 1059, 1060. You have for the first time a self-consciously declared independent papacy, an independent papacy, declaring it free from all secular control, then supporting secular Christian princes who, chosen by God, free the church. That's the crucial novelty. That's the crucial novelty, not the granting of indulgences for holy war, because that goes back a long time. Holy war goes back a long time. The granting of indulgences goes back a long time. Once you've got the crusade, not called crusade, but that's what it is, set up in 1060, then you have the accoutrements, the institutional development, the cross, the vow, the indulgence. Anyway, but that's all very much in the De Expeditio Scalibus, the conquest of Santarem, and I talk about that in the book. The text of the conquest of Alcácer do Sal is interesting for other reasons, certainly for the literary sort of environment that I think Goswin was operating in. And I also think that it's quite possible that Goswin also is the author of I think he's the author of the two texts. He's probably, he's most likely the author of the conquest of the text, the poem on Alcácer do Sal. But he also may well be the author of the conquest of Santarem, that text, in the way that in the form that it survives to us, because it has vestiges within the structure of the text that it's been adapted from possibly a historia, so an office for the feast of Santarem, possibly modelled on the office for the feast of Jerusalem, because there's actually a direct reference to a letter, that letter I mentioned earlier. That's why I know the date 28th of April 1100 by Paschal II, because he says when he's congratulating the Eastern Crusaders on their achievements in Palestine, he says, God has certainly renewed his miracles of old. Well, in the De Expeditio Scalibus, the conquest of Santarem, we read the outrageous assertion, God doesn't just renew his miracles of old, he surpasses them. Look what Alfonso Henriques has done with it. He's conquered with only about 25 men. He's conquered the most well-defended fortress in the whole of Iberia. And so there's all interesting things to say about it, and then the ingredients of good and legitimate kingship, and and it all feeds into, I guess, Alfonso Henriques' search for for paper approval for his own kingship, because he wants independence from Alfonso VII, independence from the King Emperors of Leon Castile. So I mean, all in all, it took a long time to put that book together. There was a huge amount to say, really, because they're short texts, but particularly the De Expeditionis Scholabus, the Conquest of Santorum, that there was so much to say about that, and you don't have to look very far beneath the surface. I didn't write anything in the book that wasn't readily given up by the evidence, if you see what I mean. So you don't really have to push things too far. So there we are.
Okay, well, I will have to read it. I want to read it, so thank you. Just published, so I will try to get it. So, well, Professor Wilson, there are no any other questions, so what we have to say is that it was a really amazing exposition, and thank you very much again for your conference. Very informative and very
invitation. Thank you for having me.
So, well, no, it was really nice to have you here. So thank you very much in the name of everyone here. So now we have to say goodbye. This is the last part, but
I hope to see you in Buenos Aires soon.
Well, we hope so, in Brasilia or Buenos Aires. Hope so. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone.
Ciao.
Adios.